Have you ever stood in a room so full of flowers that the scent felt like it should be comforting, yet all you could smell was grief? The lilies and roses were everywhere. Their perfume filled the church, sweet and thick, like Edward always loved. But to me, they smelled like endings. Like the silence that comes after a final breath. My hands trembled as I sat in the front pew, eyes locked on the mahogany casket that held my husband of 52 years. 52 years. Gone in a whisper. "Are you okay, Mom?" My daughter Lillian leaned over, her voice soft, her hand squeezing mine. Her eyes were red, but she'd managed to hold herself together better than I had. I tried to nod, but it felt like I was wearing someone else's body. What was there to say? That the world had lost its axis? That I didn't know who I was now that Edward was gone? The church doors creaked open again. I turned, already knowing who it would be. Gavin, my son, walked in, tall, clean-cut, and eerily calm. He looked so much like his father in his younger days that for a moment, my chest tightened with a cruel, foolish hope. But then she appeared beside him. Victoria. Her black dress looked like it came straight off a designer runway, perfectly tailored to her slim figure, accessorized with a pearl necklace and a face painted into perfect neutrality. Not sadness. Not even respect. Just control. Calculated elegance. They hadn't visited Edward once during his final months in hospice. Not a single night. There had always been a reason. Gavin was working late. Victoria was managing a client dinner. Even on the worst days, when Edward begged for the sound of his son's voice, the excuses rolled in like clockwork. "I should go say hello," I whispered to Lillian, trying to gather the strength to stand. "Don't, Mom. Please." Her voice was tight. "Not today." Lillian and Gavin hadn't spoken in nearly a year, not since the fight. Edward's cancer had drawn battle lines. Lillian wanted to try an aggressive new treatment. Victoria called it financial recklessness. Gavin followed her lead, like he always did. The music shifted. The pastor stepped up, voice gentle but distant. He spoke of Edward's achievements, his faith, his love for his family. But I could barely hear. My head was full of other sounds, Edward laughing as he grilled on the back patio, the clink of ice in our glasses during those porch sunsets, the creak of our rocking chairs in rhythm. A life lived in the quiet spaces. When the time came for family to speak, Lillian stood first. Her voice shook but didn't break as she told stories of her father teaching her to build a birdhouse, helping her memorize flashcards before spelling bees, walking her down the aisle with tears in his eyes. She was luminous in her grief, strong and steady, like the girl I'd raised. Gavin declined to speak. He sat stiffly, eyes trained on a distant corner of the church ceiling. Victoria leaned in and whispered something in his ear, her lips barely moving. Whatever it was made him clench his jaw tighter. Then it was my turn. My knees protested as I stood, the weight of the moment almost unbearable. I gripped the podium like a lifeline and looked out at the sea of black. Friends. Colleagues. Neighbors. And strangers, some whose names I'd forgotten, others whose faces reminded me of long-ago barbecues and birthday parties. "Edward," I began, and the name alone cracked my voice. Edward was my best friend. My partner in everything. I let the tears come. 52 years of love deserved no less. We faced it all together, I continued, from lean years and lost jobs to the births of our children and the joy of becoming grandparents. He was the first person I wanted to talk to every morning and the last I kissed goodnight. Always. From the corner of my eye, I saw it. Victoria. Whispering again. This time to the woman beside her. And then, a smirk. I tried to stay focused. I spoke of our dreams. Our nights curled up on the couch watching old westerns. The way he always kept fresh sunflowers in a jar on the kitchen table because he knew I loved yellow. But as I returned to my seat, the words came. Just loud enough to pierce the air. "Crocodile tears," Victoria said. "She shouldn't even be crying." Everyone knows they were practically separated. Gasps. Sharp, breathless gasps. Like a wave of ice through the pews. I froze mid-step. Separated? The word struck like a slap. I felt the blood drain from my face. I could feel everyone's eyes shift. Lillian stood halfway up, fists clenched. "How dare you," she hissed under her breath. But it wasn't Lillian's silence that cut deepest. It was Gavin's. My son said nothing. Didn't scold his wife. Didn't rise in protest. He simply stared at the floor, cheeks flushed, not in shame for her, but in embarrassment for me. I made it back to my seat. Barely. And for the rest of the service, I sat there, numb. 52 years of shared life, reduced to whispered gossip by a woman who never truly belonged, while my son remained a silent accomplice. The service ended. The guests offered polite hugs and filtered out. Victoria walked out like a queen, head high, arm locked around Gavin's. She didn't look back, except once. Just once. Our eyes met. And she smiled. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Edward had one last surprise waiting. His will. And that changed everything. There's a stillness after a funeral that feels like time itself is holding its breath. We stood outside the church as the last of the guests drifted toward their cars, the sun now casting long shadows across the pavement. The air had cooled, and I clutched my shawl a little tighter. I could still hear Victoria's voice, echoing in my head like a bell I couldn't unring. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Edward had left strict instructions. His will was to be read immediately after the service, no delays, no exceptions. It was a request he made weeks before he passed, and he had insisted on it with such quiet conviction that I dared not question it. We gathered at the law office of Martin Keller, Edward's attorney and longtime friend. The conference room was lined with dark wood shelves stacked with legal tomes, but the most noticeable feature was the heavy silence. Victoria sat across from me, legs crossed, manicured fingers drumming an impatient beat on the polished table. Gavin sat beside her, looking like a man halfway through a foggy dream he didn't understand. Lillian was to my left, her presence grounding. She reached for my hand under the table and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "Before we begin," Martin said, adjusting his glasses, "Edward left a letter. He asked that it be read aloud by his wife." He slid the envelope toward me. My name, Eleanor Dawson, was written in Edward's familiar cursive, steady despite the pain he must have been in. My hands trembled as I opened it. I took a deep breath and read. "My dearest family. If you're hearing this, it means I've moved on to whatever's next. Don't let grief hold you too tightly. I had a good life, full of love, laughter, and meaning. And I'm at peace with what's to come. Eleanor, my love, everything I've ever been, I owe to you. You stood by me when I had nothing but dreams, and stayed even when those dreams faded. You've given me a life worth living, and I want to make sure you're protected now that I'm gone. Gavin, my son. I see the man you've become, and while my heart aches for how far you've drifted, I hold hope. You were raised with love, taught to value truth and loyalty. I hope one day, you'll find your way back to that. Lillian, thank you for your fierce strength, especially during my illness. Your mother will need that strength now. This may surprise some of you. But know that it was written with clarity, not anger. I've made my peace. And I hope one day, you all will too. With love, Edward." I looked up to find Victoria watching me like a hawk. She wasn't touched. She wasn't moved. She was calculating. Her lips curved slightly as if daring the next sentence to bring her fortune. Mr. Keller cleared his throat. "Now, to the terms of Edward Dawson's final will and testament." I held Lillian's hand tighter. "To my wife, Eleanor Dawson," he began, "I leave our home at 28 Brighton Lane, free of all liens, and a monthly stipend of $4,000 for the remainder of her natural life." I exhaled. I had suspected as much. The house held more than just furniture. it held 52 years of memories. To my daughter, Lillian May Dawson Kerrigan, I leave the sum of $100,000, and my personal collection of first-edition novels. Lillian gasped quietly. Those books, mostly leather-bound treasures Edward had collected since college, were dear to him. She had always admired them, and he had once told her, "When I'm gone, I want these in the hands of someone who reads with their heart." Victoria sat forward slightly now, eyes bright with anticipation. To my son, Gavin Edward Dawson, Keller continued, I leave the sum of $10,000. Victoria's expression shattered. That's it, she blurted, losing all pretense of decorum. Gavin's head jerked toward her, stunned. Keller raised a hand. I'm not finished. Mr. Dawson has also established a trust fund of $250,000 in the name of his grandson, Nathaniel Gavin Dawson. The trust is to be used exclusively for Nathaniel's education, healthcare, and essential needs. The co-trustees are Mrs. Eleanor Dawson and myself. Victoria's face turned crimson. Exclusively? What does that mean? It means, Keller said calmly, you can't touch it. Her mouth opened, then shut again. The blow landed hard. She had clearly expected a windfall, one she could control, manipulate, and spend. Instead, Edward had ensured his grandson was protected from the very person who thought she could cash in on his death. But there was more. As for the remainder of my estate, Keller continued, including investments, retirement accounts, and life insurance benefits, I hereby leave to the Edward and Eleanor Dawson Foundation, established to fund pediatric cancer research in memory of our daughter, Samantha. There was a beat of silence so heavy it seemed to drag the air down with it. Samantha. Our firstborn. The daughter we lost to leukemia at just 9 years old. Even after all these years, the pain of her loss could still sneak up like a tide, knocking me off balance. We had talked often, quietly, over tea, about creating something in her memory. But I hadn't known Edward had followed through. That he'd made it real. Victoria surged to her feet. This is absurd. There must be a mistake. Gavin is his son. He deserves. Victoria, Keller interrupted firmly. Mr. Dawson anticipated this response. He left documentation explaining his decisions, including records of financial assistance provided to Gavin over the years, loans for business ventures, down payments, even your car. Victoria's lips quivered, her voice shrill. This isn't fair. It's perfectly legal, Keller said. And very thorough. Victoria stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Gavin remained in his seat, frozen, looking like a man who had just seen a ghost. He turned toward me slowly, his voice hollow. Mom. I didn't know about the foundation. About Samantha. There's a lot you don't know, Gavin, I said softly. But maybe now, you'll start asking the right questions. He didn't reply. Just sat there. Still. Quiet. Ashamed. The meeting ended. Lillian and I gathered our things, and as we were about to leave, Keller handed me a second envelope. One more thing, he said, his voice gentler now. Edward asked that I give you this privately. Inside the envelope was a single brass key. And a note. For when you're ready. All my love. E. I had no idea what it unlocked. But something told me, it was about to change everything. It's strange how the moments we brush off, small doubts, fleeting instincts, turn out to be warnings written in bold red ink, and we only read them clearly in hindsight. That night, after the will reading, I sat at the edge of my bed, Edward's note and the brass key lying beside me. My room was quiet, but my thoughts were a whirlwind. The past and the present collided in waves, pulling me backward, back to the very beginning. I had never fully trusted Victoria. Not from the moment she first walked through our front door, her arms full of roses she claimed were her favorite, even though I knew Gavin was allergic. She had that kind of polished charm that felt prepackaged. Her laughter was always perfectly timed, her questions about our family just a little too rehearsed. That night, over roast chicken and wine, I remember glancing at Edward across the table. He reached for my hand under the tablecloth, gave it a quiet squeeze. A signal we'd developed over the years. He felt it too. But when we brought it up, gently, cautiously, Gavin had bristled. "She's just nervous," he insisted. "She's trying to make a good impression." He was 40 then. Still single. Still carrying the weight of every wedding invitation with a +1 he never filled. Victoria was smart, beautiful, confident. She made him feel seen. Wanted. And that made her dangerous. Their engagement came quickly, too quickly. The wedding? Extravagant. Lavish. Everything Gavin used to say he didn't want. Edward and I offered to contribute modestly, what we could. We'd always lived simply, saved carefully. But Victoria made it clear our help was, in her words, cute. I overheard her whispering to Gavin at the reception, "Your parents don't get how important appearances are. But it's sweet, in a dated kind of way." I should have known then. I did know then. But what mother wants to drive a wedge between her son and his happiness? At first, the changes in Gavin were subtle. Calls that used to come weekly dropped to monthly. Family dinners were always tentative. Victoria had business trips, events, charity galas. And when they did show up, she always had one eye on the clock. "Gavin needs rest," she'd say, or, "He has a flight in the morning." And Gavin? He looked like he wanted to stay longer, but he always left with her. Birthdays came and went. Holidays, too. Victoria always had an excuse. Always a reason that made her absence sound noble or necessary. When Lillian gave birth to her daughter, our first grandchild, Gavin and Victoria showed up 3 days late. "We had a fundraiser for the Arts Council," she explained, with a dazzling smile and zero remorse. She didn't even hold the baby. Then came the comments. Not sharp ones, subtle ones. Soft as poison. "They mean well, but they don't really get our lifestyle. Your mom's sweet, but she's still stuck in that caretaker role, you know? Some mothers just can't let go." And Gavin, he stopped defending us. At first, it was small things. "Don't start a fight," he'd say when we'd call out her rudeness. Then it became silence. Agreement. Submission. And when Edward got sick, everything changed. The diagnosis had come just over 3 years ago. Stage 2 pancreatic cancer. The doctors were hopeful but cautious. Aggressive treatment, they said. Expensive. Intense. We were willing to give everything. Time, money, energy, whatever it took. But Victoria? "We need to be realistic," she said during the first family meeting. "These treatments will destroy your retirement." And for what? A few extra months? Even Gavin's face had fallen. But Victoria, ever the actress, shifted gears. Her eyes filled with crocodile tears, and she took my hand like we were old friends. "I'm just worried," she said. "I want what's best for all of us. Sometimes that means making hard choices." That was her trick. Cruelty disguised as compassion. She knew how to make selfishness sound like sacrifice. And Gavin? He bought it. Every word. After Edward's first round of chemo, when he responded well, I saw it, the flicker of disappointment in Victoria's eyes. She had been expecting a shorter timeline. Maybe even planning for it. Shortly after, the questions started. Innocent on the surface, but I knew better. "Have you updated the will recently? Is the house fully paid off? What about life insurance, do you have enough coverage?" Edward and I tried to answer calmly. But inside, we both knew what she was really asking. She saw his illness as a countdown. A payday. One night, after a particularly uncomfortable dinner where she grilled us about our finances between bites of filet mignon, Edward led me to his study. "I need to make some changes," he said, voice low, eyes tired. "To the will. To everything." I didn't ask what. I didn't have to. I just want to protect what matters, he whispered, pressing a kiss to my forehead. Over the next few months, he met with Mr. Keller often. I never asked for details. It was enough to know he was thinking clearly and that he was trying to shield the people he loved most from the storm he knew was coming. When the cancer came back, fiercer this time, we both knew. Edward wasn't afraid. He was resolved. "Promise me something," he asked one night, as I held his hand in the sterile silence of his hospital room. "Don't tell them about the changes. Not until I'm gone. Especially not her. She'll try to make Gavin contest it." "I promise," I said, tears soaking his pillow. And I kept that promise. I kept it when Victoria stopped visiting, saying, "I can't bear to see him like that." I kept it when Gavin came alone, guilt in his eyes, silence on his lips. I kept it through the funeral, even as her accusations ripped through me like glass. And now, as I held that brass key in my hand, I knew Edward had one more truth left to tell. The next morning, I stood in the kitchen, pouring a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The brass key sat on the counter, glinting in the early sunlight like it had something to say. I hadn't slept. The letter. The will. Victoria's fury. Gavin's silence. It was all replaying in my mind on a loop, but it was that key that haunted me most. Edward had always been deliberate with his actions, never one for theatrics. So if he'd left something behind, something secret, it meant there was still more to this story. Lillian called just after 8 a.m. "Mom, have you seen what Victoria posted?" My stomach dropped. "Posted where?" "Facebook. She's telling people you and Dad manipulated him into changing the will while he was sick. She's tagging relatives. Old friends. Even people from Gavin's work." Of course she was. I closed my eyes and let out a long breath. Let her talk. The people who knew Edward won't believe a word of it. "I know that," Lillian said. "But she's making you and Dad look like villains. And Gavin's not saying anything. He's just letting it happen." By noon, my phone was buzzing non-stop. Texts. Calls. Emails. A few were supportive, others, not so much. Some were laced with concern. A few outright accusations. "You should share the inheritance. It's only fair. Gavin's still his son. This must be a misunderstanding. Edward was always about family." It felt like being slowly erased from my own story. And then the doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole. It was Gavin. Alone. He looked awful, worn down, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes like bruises. I opened the door without a word, stepping aside. He entered slowly, like a man unsure of his welcome. "We need to talk," he said. I led him to the living room. He sat on the edge of the couch like it might reject him. "Victoria wants to contest the will," he said quietly. "She's already spoken to a lawyer." I nodded, unsurprised. "And you?" "She says Dad was manipulated. That he wasn't thinking clearly." "By me, you mean?" He winced. "I didn't say that." "She did." There was a long silence. Finally, I asked, "What debts do you have, Gavin?" He looked away. "She started a wellness brand, supplements, beauty kits, a podcast. It's not going well. There were investments. Expenses. She said we could use the inheritance to fix it." "So she married you expecting money?" "That's not fair." "Isn't it?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. "She's trying to separate you from everyone who might tell you the truth," I said, my voice quiet. "That's not love, Gavin. That's control." He ran his hands through his hair. "She said I have to choose. Between you and her." And then I saw it, something I hadn't seen in years. Hurt. Real hurt. Confusion. Regret. He wasn't just a man caught between two women, he was a boy lost in a forest he'd let someone else map for him. I hesitated, then walked to the kitchen and returned with the envelope. The key. The note. "Your father left this for me," I said. "I think he wanted me to use it if it ever came to this." I handed it to him. He turned the key over in his hand, eyebrows knitting. "What's it for?" "I don't know yet." That evening, after Gavin left, promising to think things through, I went upstairs. I hadn't touched Edward's study since the funeral. His jacket was still draped over the armchair. His reading glasses sat on the desk, resting on an unfinished crossword puzzle. The sight of it stole my breath for a moment. Behind his suits in the closet, there was a small safe. Nothing big. Something we'd used for insurance documents and family records. I knelt down, heart pounding, and inserted the key. The lock clicked open. Inside was a large manila envelope with my name on it, and the familiar, looping handwriting that had signed every birthday card for 5 decades. Inside were pages, dozens of them. Bank statements. Transfer records showing thousands of dollars withdrawn from Gavin's accounts and funneled into one solely in Victoria's name. Credit card bills. Jewelry, designer clothes, luxury spa treatments, all charged while she claimed they were in debt. Screenshots. Private messages from Victoria's social media. Chats with her friends mocking me and Edward. Calling us fossils. Saying things like, "Once the old man croaks, we're golden." Most damning of all? A consultation letter from a divorce lawyer. Dated just 4 months ago. 3 weeks before Edward passed. She'd been planning to leave Gavin once the money was in her hands. I sat on the floor, surrounded by betrayal, and wept, not for myself, but for my son. He'd been used. Played. Poisoned. And now I had a choice. Do I show him? Do I destroy what little faith he still has in the life he built? Or do I hide it, and risk him staying chained to a woman who had never truly loved him? I didn't get to answer. Because that decision showed up on my doorstep. Again. The third time my doorbell rang that week, I expected a delivery or perhaps Lillian. But when I looked through the peephole, my heart sank. Victoria. Perfectly put together, as always, makeup flawless, clothes expensive but understated, like she was aiming for, sophisticated widow despite not having lost anyone. She stood on my porch with a face carved out of porcelain and an expression that screamed diplomacy, but it was the kind of diplomacy you brought to a battlefield. "Eleanor," she said with syrupy sweetness when I opened the door, "I thought we should talk." Woman to woman. Every nerve in my body told me to close the door. But curiosity, or maybe the lingering echo of Edward's voice whispering, "Trust your instincts," made me step aside and let her in. She didn't waste time. "This house has potential," she said, eyes sweeping across the living room like a real estate agent. "With the right renovations, it could be worth a lot." "It's not for sale," I said flatly. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Of course not. But it's really too much house for one person, don't you think? Maintenance, taxes, it adds up." I didn't respond. She moved to the couch and sat without being invited, crossing her legs elegantly, back ramrod straight. "I'll be direct," she said, voice lowering. "Gavin deserves his fair share of Edward's estate. What happened with the will, it wasn't fair. It wasn't rational. I think you know that." I stayed silent, watching her carefully. "If you agreed to contest the will with us," she continued, "we could come to an arrangement that benefits everyone. Gavin gets what he deserves, you maintain control of the house, and we avoid ugly court drama." "Everyone meaning you," I said quietly. Her smile tightened. "This foundation, it's a sweet idea. But charity begins at home, Eleanor. Edward should have looked after his own blood first." I stood. "Edward knew exactly what he was doing," I said, voice calm but firm. "He saw through you a long time ago. You've never cared about this family. Only what you could get from it. That was when her mask slipped. "You've never liked me," she snapped. "You poisoned Gavin against me from the start." "No, Victoria," I said. "You did that all on your own." She stood too now, face flushed with frustration. "He'll choose me, you know. He always does. And when he does, you'll be left with your dead husband's memory and an empty house." And then she left, her heels clicking sharply across the hardwood like an accusation. I stood in the silence that followed, the weight of her words pressing against my chest. Would Gavin choose her again? Had she really sunk her claws so deep that he'd return, tail between his legs, begging forgiveness from a woman who had planned to rob and leave him? That night, I dreamed of Edward. We were young again, walking hand in hand along the same beach we'd visited on our honeymoon. He was smiling, sun-kissed, wind-blown, the same glint in his eye I fell in love with all those years ago. "Trust me, Dream," Edward said. "It's all going to be okay." I woke with tears on my face, and for the first time since the funeral, a glimmer of peace. Until the next morning, when I got a text from Gavin. "She wants to move out of state. Says there's nothing left for us here." I stared at the message, cold dread pooling in my stomach. This was her next move, to isolate him completely. If she couldn't silence me, she'd distance him. Permanently. That's when I knew. It was time. I went to the dining table and carefully laid out everything Edward had left in the envelope: bank records, screenshots, the divorce consultation letter. I wasn't just preparing to show Gavin. I was preparing to free him. The doorbell rang again. This time, it was Gavin. He looked worse than before. A duffel bag hung off one shoulder. His hair was a mess, his shirt wrinkled, his face hollowed with exhaustion. "I left," he said, stepping inside. "We had a fight. A bad one. She gave me an ultimatum. Said I had to cut ties with you or she was done." He dropped the bag beside the couch and sank into it like a man who no longer had the strength to hold up his own frame. "What did you say?" I asked gently. "That I needed time," he said. "And she lost it. Said things about Dad. About you. About how she was just waiting for him to die. That all of this, our family, was just a stepping stone to the lifestyle she deserves." I sat beside him, heartbreaking. "What did you say?" I repeated. "I left." Silence settled between us. It wasn't empty. It was full. Full of truth, pain, history. "I have something to show you," I said. I opened the envelope and laid everything out. I watched his face change as he read. The financial statements. The mocking messages. The betrayal. The letter to the divorce attorney. Shock gave way to disbelief. Then to grief. And then, finally, to rage. "All this time," he whispered, "I defended her. I chose her over you and Dad. I thought you were trying to control me." "She was very good at making you think that," I said. "But deep down, Gavin, you knew. You just didn't want to believe it." He stood suddenly, pacing the room like a man trapped in his own mind. "How can you forgive me so easily?" "Because I'm your mother," I said. "And because I know who you really are. The boy your father and I raised is still in there. You're finding your way back." He looked at me, eyes glistening. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and hugged me, tight. Like he was afraid letting go would mean losing everything all over again. That night, as he unpacked in his old bedroom, I sat in Edward's chair, watching the stars blink to life outside the window. And I knew the healing had begun. The next morning, over a breakfast of toast and lukewarm coffee, Gavin and I sat in a quiet stillness broken only by the occasional clink of his spoon against the mug. He looked different. Not younger, or happier, exactly, but clearer. Like someone who'd just come out of a storm with his boots still wet, but the sun beginning to shine through. "I'm going to file for divorce," he said, his voice even, resolute. I nodded. I figured. He stared down into his coffee. I'm not worried about the legal stuff. What scares me is Nathaniel. She's already threatened to take him. Said if I push this, she'll move out of state and I'll never see him again. I felt something inside me stiffen. Maternal instinct, maybe. Or perhaps it was just Edward's echo rising up in me like a wave. She won't, I said. Not if we do this right. My phone buzzed. It was Lillian. Mom, you need to check Facebook again, she said, breathless. Victoria's posting about Gavin now. She's saying he's unstable. That he's abandoned Nathaniel. That he's mentally unfit. Gavin's face went pale as I relayed the message. He stood abruptly, fury etched into every line of his face. That's it. I'm done being quiet. He pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the screen. I've been silent too long, he muttered aloud as he typed. Out of respect for my late father and my family, I've let rumors and accusations go unanswered. But I won't anymore. The truth is, my marriage has been built on manipulation. My wife married me for financial gain, not love. My parents saw what I refused to see. Dad, if you're watching, I finally understand what you were trying to tell me. I'm sorry it took me so long. He hit post. And just like that, the tide turned. Within minutes, the comments began to pour in. Old college friends. Distant cousins. Neighbors. Colleagues. Messages of support, solidarity, and shock. But then came the texts, from Victoria. Fury. Threats. Promises. Manipulation wrapped in desperation. She's threatening to take Nathaniel and disappear, Gavin said. She says she'll get sole custody. That she has evidence I'm unstable. I rose, walked to the cabinet, and pulled out the envelope Edward had left me. The same one that had freed Gavin from his fog now held the very thing we needed to protect his son. She's not taking Nathaniel anywhere, I said. Your father made sure of that. His eyes snapped to mine. What do you mean? I laid the documents out on the table like cards in a final hand. Screenshots of her taunts. The divorce attorney consultation letter. Bank records showing financial misconduct. Messages mocking Nathaniel's role as a bargaining chip. She doesn't just look unfit, I said. She is unfit. And Edward knew this battle was coming. That's why he kept records. That's why he made you co-trustee of Nathaniel's fund, so she couldn't touch it. Gavin sat down slowly, processing the weight of it. What do we do? He asked. We go to court, I replied. And we bring every page. Within a week, the documents were filed. Victoria, true to form, fought like a woman cornered. She made false claims, mental illness, parental neglect, emotional abuse. She submitted edited screenshots and even tried to paint Gavin as financially irresponsible using doctored bank statements. But Edward had seen that coming too. Our attorney, Mr. Keller, had meticulously archived Gavin's financial history, loans Edward had given him over the years, all noted and explained. None were unpaid. All were forgiven quietly, as any loving father might do. It painted a picture not of recklessness, but of a man trying to build a life under the pressure of a woman who bled him dry. In court, the evidence from Edward's envelope was decisive. The judge read every document carefully. And when it was all over, the verdict was clear. Gavin was awarded full physical and legal custody of Nathaniel. Victoria was granted supervised visitation, contingent on her completing a psychological evaluation and 6 months of counseling. She left the state 3 weeks later. Rumor had it she'd moved to California with a new boyfriend, an investor in her failed wellness brand. Her visits with Nathaniel became infrequent. Sometimes she'd cancel last minute. Other times, she wouldn't show up at all. At first, Nathaniel asked questions. Where's Mommy? Why didn't she call? But children are wiser than we give them credit for. Over time, he stopped asking. Instead, he drew closer to his father, and to me. One afternoon, nearly a year after Edward's funeral, we held a quiet celebration in our backyard. The grass was freshly trimmed. The grill was fired up. And the porch swing, the one Edward had hung with his own hands, creaked gently as Nathaniel curled up beside me, barefoot and laughing. Lillian was there too, arranging fruit trays, chatting with Gavin as he flipped burgers. We weren't the same family we had been before. We were better. Battle-worn, yes. But honest. United. The wounds were healing, and the roots Edward had so carefully planted were holding firm. That evening, as I sat alone on the swing watching the stars blink to life, Gavin joined me with a small leather journal in hand. "I found this," he said softly. "In the garage. It's Dad's, I think." I took it with reverence, fingers tracing the worn edges. It was Edward's handwriting. His thoughts. His final reflections. We opened it together. On the first page, he had written, "Legacy isn't money or land. It's love passed down. Wisdom offered. Protection given, even when we're gone." We read in silence for a long time. And when we finally looked up, the moon was high, and the world felt, for the first time in months, quiet. Whole. It had been 2 years since Edward's funeral, and the house no longer felt like a shrine to the past. It felt alive again. Spring had arrived early that year. The garden Edward had once tended with loving precision had bloomed into a riot of color: lilacs, hydrangeas, tulips. Lillian had taken to stopping by on weekends with her daughter, Grace, helping Nathaniel plant vegetables in the small beds Edward had built from reclaimed wood. Nathaniel, now 10, had grown taller, his voice still soft but more certain. He had his father's eyes and his grandfather's quiet curiosity. Most days after school, he'd burst through the door with grass stains on his jeans and new facts about bugs or planets or books he'd found in Edward's old collection. Gavin, now 44, had moved into a cozy house just 2 streets down from mine. We called it the Blue House because Nathaniel liked to paint the porch railings a new shade each summer. They came over every Friday for family dinner, no excuses, no cancellations. He was different now. Lighter. He still carried guilt, but it no longer controlled him. He was a good father. A present one. He'd even gone back to teaching part-time at the local community college, a dream he'd abandoned early in his marriage to Victoria when she insisted it didn't align with their lifestyle. One Saturday morning, I found Nathaniel in Edward's old study, curled up on the pull-out sofa with a book twice the size of his head. "Whatcha reading?" I asked, stepping inside with a tray of muffins. "Grandpa's journal," he said, without looking up. My heart skipped. "I thought you weren't ready for that yet." "I am now," he said simply. "Dad said I could. And he said you'd tell me the stories that didn't make it into the book." I sat beside him, the pages open between us. We started reading together. Entry by entry. Word by word. The ones about Samantha, our firstborn, made me pause. Nathaniel didn't know everything, not yet, but he knew she had been part of us. And when he asked gentle questions, I answered honestly. "She had your smile," I told him. "And your wild imagination." He nodded, processing. "Do you think she would have liked me?" "I think she would have adored you," I said. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel and I planted a tree in the far corner of the backyard. A red maple. Edward had always wanted one, but never got around to it. Now, as Nathaniel dug into the earth with a small shovel, I felt Edward's presence in the breeze, in the way the leaves whispered against each other. "Grandpa would have loved this," Nathaniel said, wiping dirt from his hands. "He would have," I agreed, my voice catching. "He always said a tree was a promise to the future." Nathaniel smiled, his eyes bright with understanding beyond his years. "I think he meant us." That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table. Lillian and Grace had brought fresh bread from the bakery, and Gavin had cooked one of Edward's favorite recipes, a hearty stew that filled the house with warmth. We ate, laughed, and shared stories, the kind that started with, "Remember when," and ended with tears of joy. As the night wore on, Nathaniel pulled out Edward's journal again, his small fingers tracing the words as if they were a map to something sacred. "Grandma," he asked, "what's the best story that's not in here?" I thought for a moment, then smiled. "The day your grandpa and I met. It was at a little cafe, and he spilled coffee all over my dress." Instead of apologizing, he just laughed and said, "Well, now you'll never forget me." Nathaniel giggled. "And did you?" "Never," I said, my heart full. "Not for a single day." As the stars blinked to life outside, I sat on the porch swing, the same one Edward had hung with his own hands. The air was cool, but the warmth of the evening lingered in my chest. Gavin stepped out, a mug of tea in his hand, and sat beside me. "He's still here, isn't he?" Gavin said softly, his eyes on the garden. I nodded. "In every bloom, every laugh, every moment we're together." Gavin smiled, a quiet peace settling over him. I think I finally understand what he meant by legacy. We sat in companionable silence, the swing creaking gently beneath us. The house, the garden, the family, it was all part of something bigger now. Something Edward had nurtured long before we knew we'd need it. And as I looked out at the red maple standing tall in the moonlight, I knew that we, too, were growing, rooted in love, reaching for the future. For the first time in a long time, the world felt whole again.